YouTube? I'm back with another video. In this video, we're going to be reacting to what happened to the biggest NBA trades of 2010. In the last video, this actually is a good back-to-back video because this one talks about the 2010s, and then the last video I watched about also talks about the 2010s. So what happens to the biggest NBA trades of 2010s, and then we're also going to understand that we already watched about the draft. Now we're going to understand the biggest trades in 2010s. So a lot about 2010s, basically what I'm saying. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, sorry. Let's just get straight into this video. I'm glad that y'all here with me today. Let us enjoy this video. Let's enjoy this content together, and let's just react. That's the point of the channel. I like to react to videos. If y'all have any other ideas for what you want me to do, please put that down in the comments. I love to give you guys what you want to see. I don't want to just put things off of the fly, but I do it because y'all don't really comment that much, but I don't have that many followers right now, so I understand. Let's not get carried, let's not do too much talking. Let's just get straight into the video. Bye. Right now.
The 2010s was a wild decade in the NBA, with so much more player movement than at any other time in the history of the league, which led to some pretty incredible trades. Ones that ruined teams, ended eras, shaped the future of franchises, and some that even led directly to an NBA championship. And that last part, believe it or not, is 100% true with our first trade, Carmelo Anthony to the New York Knicks. Back at the trade deadline in 2011, it was clear that Melo did not want to be with the Nuggets anymore. They'd had some playoff success, but he had his eyes set on a bigger market, specifically New York. This was an especially dire situation for the Nuggets because Melo was an unrestricted free agent in 2011, and without him, their team would be a complete disaster. Their hand was forced, and Melo got his wish, being sent to the Knicks for Wilson Chandler, Raymond Felton, Danilo Gallinari, Timofey Mozgov, and 3 first-round picks. The actual trade was much more complicated, but those are the main pieces. With the Knicks, Melo had some great moments, but the promise of pairing him with Amar'e Stoudemire just never quite came together the way that fans hoped. Amar'e dealt with injury issues, and the Knicks were never truly a threat to make the finals with Melo, but for the Nuggets, this turned out to be one of the most significant trades in franchise history. Every piece in the deal helped them in some way over the years, either on the court or as a trade asset, but most importantly, the 2016 first-round pick that they got in this trade became Jamal Murray, who is the second best player on their 2023 title team, and without him, even with the brilliance of the rest of the roster, they don't win that title. This trade's kind of a weird one to look back on in hindsight because both teams did pretty well in the immediate aftermath, and of course the Nuggets win a title because of the deal, but I wonder if this situation had happened today, if the Knicks would have just waited to sign Carmelo a few months later in 2011 free agency, which they had the money to do and could have kept the asset from a trade instead. Next up is an unprecedented moment in the history of the league, Chris Paul to the LA Clippers. The reason
What? We're back. No, we're not. It's another ad. It's another ad. It's another ad. And we're back.
of course, is that Paul was never supposed to end up with the Clippers in the first place. Back in 2011, the New Orleans Hornets franchise was not in a good place at all, and were actually without an owner completely. In place of that, the team was actually owned by the NBA itself, essentially putting at the time NBA Commissioner David Stern in place as the owner of the team. To make things that much worse, their best player, Chris Paul, had requested a trade from the team as well. They had little to no direction moving forward, and he didn't want to waste his prime as one of the best guards in the league on a team without any chance of being good soon. As a result, the Hornets agreed to a trade to send Paul to the Lakers, a 3-team trade in which the Rockets would get Pau Gasol and the Hornets would get Lamar Odom, Kevin Martin, Louis Scola, Goran Dragic, and draft compensation. The GMs of both teams agreed to the deal, and it seemed like Chris Paul was going to be a Laker. However, and again, this has never happened before, the league itself vetoed the trade. More accurately, David Stern, as acting owner of the Hornets, declined the trade and it was called off. The only reason that the league had any say in the deal was because of the unique ownership situation at the time, and it's also important to understand that there was pushback from other owners around the league that the Paul to the Lakers deal was simply unfair and that the Lakers weren't giving up enough in the deal, creating somewhat of a super team in LA, and that certainly could have led to Stern's decision. Ultimately, not much later, Paul does end up going to LA, but this time to the Clippers in exchange for Al-Farouq Aminu, Eric Gordon, Chris Kaman, and a first-round pick. While in LA, Paul led the Clippers to their most relevant era ever as a franchise. They were the most exciting team in the league, with CP3, Blake Griffin, and DeAndre Jordan creating Lob City in LA. Unfortunately, due to injuries and other factors, though, they never had the kind of postseason success that their talent suggested they should have had. For the Hornets, this trade package turned out to be awful. None of the players did anything significant for the franchise, and the first-round pick became Austin Rivers, who also did nothing for them. They were bad enough the following season to earn the first pick in the 2012 draft, though, which got them Anthony Davis, who turned into a ton of stuff down the line in a trade with, ironically, the Lakers. But honestly, either trade package for Paul from either LA team would have and ended up being pretty much a complete disaster. Next up is a crazy one because there are just so many pieces to this deal. Back in the summer of 2012, we finally got a resolution to the years-long Dwight Howard saga in Orlando. He went from requesting a trade to opting into a new contract to requesting a trade again, and in the summer of 2012, he finally got his wish. But this turned into a massive 4-team deal. Essentially, and this is very complicated, so I'm going to put the full trade on screen here, the Lakers traded Andrew Bynum to the Sixers traded Andre Iguodala to the Nuggets, the Magic traded Dwight Howard to the Lakers, and the Nuggets sent out some contracts, and draft compensation was exchanged between various teams. Let's start with the Lakers. This was the summer of the LA Super Team. As a year after failing to acquire Chris Paul, they added Steve Nash and Dwight Howard to Kobe Bryant and put together what was thought to be a legitimate super team. Expectations were sky high after the Howard trade, and they failed to meet every single one of them. Injuries and a lack of chemistry resulted in the Lakers barely even being relevant that season, and Howard himself left the team in free agency after just 1 year, one of the biggest super team disasters of all time. The Nuggets also lost the main player in this deal after just 1 season, as Iguodala joined a group that would go on to be the surprise of that season, winning 57 games despite not having a true star on the team. Unfortunately, they were upset in the first round by the Warriors, and then that offseason, Iguodala forced his way to the Warriors themselves, with the Nuggets getting basically nothing in return, and Iggy would go on to win Finals MVP and multiple titles with the Warriors. The Sixers were also a huge part in all of this. They thought that by adding a player as talented as Bynum, they could transition to a new era post-Iguodala while also remaining competitive, and that simply did not happen. Due to injuries, Bynum played literally 0 games with the Sixers and played just 26 total NBA games after being traded from LA, despite being just 25 years old at the time of the deal. This trade would go on to truly be the beginning of the process in Philly, as a year later during the 2013 draft, they traded away Drew Holiday for Nerlens Noel and a pick, putting them on a path to years of tanking. The Magic were actually the big winners in this massive deal. They ended up with Nikola Vucevic in the trade, which at the time seemed like a throw-in, but he became an all-star caliber player for them and then was later moved for Franz Wagner and Wendell Carter Jr., neither of which would be on the team without the original Dwight Howard deal. Next up is the single worst trade in the history of the league, and that is not an exaggeration. Back in the 2013 offseason, the Celtics and Nets were going in different directions. The Nets had brought in Darren Williams to go with Joe Johnson and Brook Lopez, and they thought that they would be title contenders that season. The Celtics, meanwhile, were transitioning to a new era after years of competing with Ray Allen, Paul Pierce, and Kevin Garnett leading the way. That summer, the Celtics made the shrewd decision to dump 2 pillars of their franchise, Pierce and Garnett, and start a complete rebuild. The deal was Pierce, Garnett, and some other stuff to the Nets for some expiring contracts and multiple first-round picks and pick swaps back to Boston. At the time, this seemed pretty harmless as the Nets looked to be in position to be good for the next few seasons. The problem was, the Nets were a disaster immediately. Injuries, poor coaching, and egos all got in the way right from the start, and within a few years, the Nets were one of the worst teams in the entire league and still owed all of their first-round picks to the Celtics. Ultimately, this trade reads...
Okay, we got that. They went from the biggest super team to just disaster, man. They lost so many picks. They could have had Tatum. They could have had Brown. They could have had all those players. All right, we're back.
Today as a handful of games from Garnett and Pierce with the Nets in exchange for the picks that would become Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. An entire era of Celtics basketball was created with just one trade, with the Nets getting absolutely nothing in return. And as if that wasn't bad enough, one of the expiring contracts in the Celtics deal was Gerald Wallace, who the Nets had acquired for a first-round pick the year before, and that pick became Damian Lillard. So essentially the Nets traded Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and Damian Lillard for nothing, all in an 18-month span. There will never be a worse stretch of team building in NBA history than that. We move on now to what I think is a really underrated trade, Kevin Love to the Cleveland Cavaliers. In the summer of 2014, LeBron James announced that he would be returning to Cleveland after 4 years away in Miami, and with Kyrie Irving already there and some other young talent on the roster, the future looked bright. However, LeBron wasn't going to wait around for that future to develop to compete for championships. The Cavs held the #1 pick in the draft again, their third time in 4 years, and had selected Andrew Wiggins, but it seemed obvious that LeBron had other plans in mind when he returned to the Cavs. In August, Cleveland flipped some of their young assets into a disgruntled star, Kevin Love, who'd been wasting away in Minnesota while developing into one of the best bigs in the league. The deal was the Cavs sent Wiggins and Anthony Bennett to Minnesota while sending a first-round pick to the Sixers. The Sixers sent Thaddeus Young to Minnesota, and the Timberwolves sent Kevin Love to the Cavs. Cleveland, this trade certainly helped them win the 2016 title. Although Love was obviously the third best guy on the team behind LeBron and Kyrie, his floor spacing and rebounding were critical to their success. The unfortunate thing for him is his career completely changed as a result of this trade. They won a title, yes, but he completely changed his game. In Minnesota, he was the primary offensive guy, scoring in the post and spending a ton of time at the basket while also spacing the floor, whereas in Cleveland, he was basically just a floor spacer on offense. I'm sure the title was worth it, but it was pretty shocking to see just how much being on LeBron's team changed how Love was forced to play. For the Timberwolves, this was not a great trade. Bennett did nothing for them, and although Wiggins had some great moments, he never really broke out the way most people thought that he would, despite some impressive stats early on. A few years later, they actually had to use a first-round pick just to dump Wiggins to the Warriors, where of course he did blossom into an all-star caliber player. They did get D'Angelo Russell back in that deal, and he ended up being fine for them, but to just get a few solid seasons from a few starters in exchange for a player of Love's caliber at the time is a pretty rough return. Now we have our first 3 trade section of the video, and they all involve Jimmy Butler. After being the 30th pick in the 2011 draft, Butler eventually developed into an all-star in his first few seasons with the Bulls. The problem was, as they were figuring out what the post-injury Derrick Rose era would look like, they decided to rebuild. So on draft night in 2017, Butler was sent to the Timberwolves in exchange for Chris Dunn, Zach LaVine, and Lauri Markkanen. The Timberwolves were on the verge of actually being relevant and traded for Butler to accelerate that process. They had Karl Anthony Towns and the previously mentioned Andrew Wiggins and viewed Butler as the piece that could put them over the top, and for the most part, they were right. They finally snapped their long playoff drought the following season despite some injuries to Butler, a significant accomplishment for the franchise. The problem was, Butler really didn't like being with the Timberwolves. He didn't see it as a winning situation for himself long term, and after just a year forced his way out to the Sixers, which we'll talk about here in a second. Meanwhile, for the Bulls, this trade worked out pretty well for them. Considering they wanted to rebuild, LaVine being swapped out for Butler was a pretty good move for them, even though Dunn and Markkanen never quite developed in Chicago. Both of them would later move on and not provide much in return, although Markkanen has suddenly developed into an all-star caliber player in Utah. Now to the second Butler trade, this time to the Sixers. As I mentioned, he wanted out of Minnesota, and the Timberwolves got back Robert Covington and Dario Saric in exchange for him being sent to Philly. Now those were actually more significant pieces at the time than it might seem right now, but that was really low value for Butler. Just think about the difference between what the Timberwolves had to send away a year prior compared to what they got back in this deal. This was truly a disaster for them, as neither Covington nor Saric ended up having a huge impact on the team. There were concerns about Butler at the time, namely his behavior in Minnesota and injuries that were piling up, but his value still should have been higher than this in hindsight. The team that benefited, of course, were the Sixers, who added Butler to Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid to create what is, in my opinion, the best team of the process era. They were the best defense in the league, and I truly thought they could win the title that year, but they lost to the eventual champion Raptors in Game 7 in the 2019 playoffs, missing out on their best chance at a title. Which brings us to the third Butler trade. One of the other big risks of the Sixers bringing him in the first place was that he was a 2019 free agent, and that also likely lowered his value in a trade previously. Ultimately, he used that to his advantage to force a sign and trade to the Miami Heat, a team that did not have the cap space to outright sign Butler as a free agent. There was the threat of him leaving for a new team for nothing, so the Sixers felt as though they might as well get something in exchange for him in a trade, and the Heat sent them Josh Richardson, who really didn't contribute to the Sixers at all, despite breaking out in Miami the prior few seasons. Meanwhile, with the Heat, Butler has led the team to 2 finals appearances and after 4 teams in 4 years has finally found a home in Miami. Moving on now to one of the weirdest trade situations of all time, Kyrie Irving to the Boston Celtics. After winning the title in 2016, it seemed like everything was fantastic in Cleveland, and it was for everyone except Kyrie Irving. He was so upset with the organization and having to play alongside LeBron that he actually nearly requested a trade that same offseason, just a few months after hitting one of the most iconic shots in NBA history. Ultimately, he stuck it out for one more season, and then in the 2017 offseason, he officially requested a trade from the Cavs, which basically ended that entire era of Cleveland basketball. Kyrie was able to use the leverage of a possible knee surgery to force them to trade him, basically telling them that if they didn't move him, he'd get the surgery late and miss a lot of the upcoming season. In the end, Kyrie got his wish. He was traded, just not really to where he wanted to go. The Celtics traded Jay Crowder, Isaiah Thomas, Ante Zizic, and a 2018 first-round pick from the Nets in exchange for Irving. In hindsight, this deal looks terrible, but at the time it honestly seemed pretty fair. Kyrie was a complete wild card and had some injury issues, and Isaiah Thomas was coming off of a second-team All-NBA season. Not to mention that 2018 Nets pick was seen as extremely valuable around the league. This deal gave the Cavs some depth and assets to build the team and a pretty close Kyrie replacement in Thomas. That was the idea at least, but in reality, Thomas fighting through a hip injury in the 2017 playoffs completely ruined his career, and none of the other pieces mattered at all for the Cavs in their final year with LeBron. They also famously refused to use the Nets pick to add pieces to the roster, fearing correctly that LeBron was just going to leave anyway in the 2018 offseason. That pick ultimately became Colin Sexton, who was used to acquire Donovan Mitchell, yes, but never did much for Cleveland besides put up some empty stats. For the Celtics, things did not go much better. There were moments where it looked like it would be a great fit with Kyrie, with him even going so far as to say publicly that he would re-sign, but then things changed quickly because honestly he never wanted to be in Boston in the first place. The team started to fall apart, Kyrie quit on them, and just 2 years later he signed as a free agent with the Nets. The assets they traded away ultimately weren't that valuable, but the once promising Kyrie era was pretty much
I knew that was coming. I knew it was coming. I knew it was coming. I knew it. I knew it was coming. I knew it was coming. We're back.
disaster, with him playing just 9 playoff games total in 2 seasons. Next up is actually 2 trades involving the same player. Back in 2017, Paul George had basically decided to move on from the Indiana Pacers. After a few successful playoff runs and elevating himself to an All-NBA player and recovering from a terrible leg injury a few seasons prior, he was simply ready to move on to a new situation that represented a better opportunity to win a championship. To make things more complicated for Indiana, he also had just 1 year left on his contract. He even went so far as to tell the team specifically that he would be leaving when his contract was up, so they might as well trade him to get value in return. The rumors at the time were that the Lakers were a heavy favorite to sign him that offseason, so other teams were hesitant to give up a ton to get him, further complicating the situation for the Pacers. Ultimately, in the summer of 2017, the Oklahoma City Thunder came out of nowhere and took the risk, sending Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis to the Pacers in exchange for George. Now, people freaked out about this for a variety of reasons. First off, most people thought PG was worth way more than that, and they were right, but the contract situation lowered his value. Also, that exact trade package that the Thunder sent to Indiana was what they got in exchange for Serge Ibaka a year earlier from the Magic. Serge Ibaka was a good player at the time, but in no world did him and George have the same trade value. But again, the contract was a huge part of this, and it was a massive risk for Oklahoma City. There was no guarantee that George wouldn't just leave in free agency a year later, and giving up assets for PG when Kevin Durant had also recently left in free agency in 2016 was putting a lot on the line for the future of the franchise. And mostly, this was a genius move for OKC. They never had a ton of playoff success while George was there, but he did sign an extension in the 2018 offseason, and that move, making this trade and convincing PG to stay, set up the entire future of the franchise. Which brings us to the second Paul George trade. In the summer of 2019, Kawhi Leonard was looking to head to LA as a free agent after just winning a title with the Raptors, and the Lakers and Clippers were competing for his services. That summer, he went to the Clippers and said that if they were willing to bring in Paul George, he would sign with them, which was a pretty crazy request considering George had just signed a massive contract.
That's annoying. I guess I should just awkwardly laugh about it then.
contract with OKC the summer before, and at the time, star players getting traded with multiple years left on their deals wasn't common at all. So the Clippers called the Thunder, and they were caught completely off guard. OKC was set on building around PG and Russell Westbrook and weren't planning on changing their minds. Ultimately, the deal got done, and all it took from the Clippers was every single asset that they had. Expiring contracts, SGA, and all the first-round picks and pick swaps they could trade. That was what it took for the Clippers to get Paul George, and ultimately, it was a trade for Kawhi Leonard as well. And what that deal has turned into for both sides is crazy. The Clippers haven't had the success that they hoped to when they made the deal due to injuries, while the Thunder secured the brightest future in the entire league. Not only did SGA end up becoming one of the best guards in the league, but they also used one of the Clippers picks to get Jalen Williams from Santa Clara, and they still have a ton of assets left over as well. Without that initial trade with the Pacers and the subsequent contract extension from George, the Thunder roster would look completely different. Next up is Kawhi Leonard to the Toronto Raptors. In 2018, the Raptors were a team without a true direction. They had been a contending team for years behind Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan, but always struggled to get over the hump in the postseason. However, things changed that summer as LeBron left the East to go to the Lakers, and the Raptors saw a true championship window and put together one of the riskiest NBA trades of all time. Meanwhile, Kawhi Leonard was causing all kinds of drama in San Antonio, as after years of development and turning into an MVP caliber player with the Spurs, he became frustrated with the team's handling of his injuries over the years and demanded a trade. This was a weird situation because Kawhi hadn't been healthy in a while and had just 1 year left on his deal, so the market for him was not fantastic. Ultimately, the Raptors stepped up and sent DeMar DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl, and a first-round pick that would become Keldon Johnson to the Spurs for Kawhi Leonard and Danny Green. And with that move, the Raptors won themselves a title. Kawhi got healthy, Toronto was a great team, and after an unbelievable postseason run and bad injury luck for the Warriors in the finals, the Raptors won the 2019 title. It's pretty rare for a trade to lead so directly to a championship, but that's exactly what happened here. Unfortunately, even a championship wasn't enough to keep Kawhi in town, as after just that 1 year with the team, he left for the Clippers in free agency. For the Spurs, they actually got a decent haul considering the situation at the time. I still think they could have gotten more, but DeRozan was good for them, and they later got some assets for him in a trade with the Bulls. Poeltl turned into a solid starter, and they got some stuff for him in a trade for the Raptors, and Johnson is a key part of their future. Not as much as you'd like for a future Hall of Famer, but not bad. Moving on now to Anthony Davis ending up on the LA Lakers. In 2019, Davis had made it clear that he no longer saw a future with the New Orleans Pelicans. They'd had some success, but had really struggled to put a top-tier team around him, despite him developing into one of the best players in the league, and he was seeking a move to one team and one team only, the LA Lakers. He had many connections with the team already, including sharing an agency with LeBron James, and basically told every other team in the league not to trade for him because he would simply leave as a free agent in 2020 and join the Lakers anyway. This whole situation did not sit right with the Pelicans, and it was a drawn-out process, but eventually, just like with the Paul George situation earlier, the Lakers made an offer that they couldn't refuse. Lonzo Ball, Josh Hart, Brandon Ingram, the 4th pick in the 2019 draft, and all of the first-round picks and pick swaps the Lakers could offer in exchange for Anthony Davis. This was one of, if not the biggest trades in league history, and it ended up being completely worth it. A year and a half later in the bubble, the Lakers celebrated yet another title led by LeBron and Davis, and despite the insane cost, any trade that leads to a championship is 100% worth it. For the Pelicans, they obviously got a lot in return, but it hasn't worked out exactly the way they planned. Both Lonzo and Hart were later moved for some assets that have helped them, but not a ton. Ingram has turned into an all-star caliber player, which is fantastic. They used the 4th pick in 2019 to get more assets that did get them Herb Jones, but not much else, and they've yet to get another meaningful player with any of the extra draft assets. Ingram himself makes this a good trade for them, but not as great as it might have initially seemed. Last one now, and it's one of my favorites. In the summer of 2019, every big name star was changing teams around the league, it felt like, and that was certainly true in Brooklyn. After years of struggling, the Nets were able to sign both Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant in the same summer, putting them on a path to championship contention. But in reality, the KD signing was a trade. For the Nets, it actually made sense for cap reasons to bring in Durant as a traded player, and the Golden State Warriors sent them a first-round pick along with KD to help make it happen. That pick didn't end up conveying, but what did was the Nets sending back, among other contracts, D'Angelo Russell. The Warriors convinced D'Lo to join them after his first All-Star appearance with a massive max contract, and it was one of the best decisions they ever made. Getting anything in return for Durant leaving as a free agent was always going to help them, but this one actually helped them win a title. The D'Lo experiment never worked out with the Warriors, but having him as an asset was the only reason they were able to later bring in Andrew Wiggins and Jonathan Kuminga as a first-round pick in 2020. They bet on themselves being able to turn around Wiggins' career, and they were right. As he developed into an all-star, and without him, they simply don't win the 2021 title, as he was one of the best players in the series. For the Nets, the KD era certainly was a disappointment, but there were some great moments, and in many ways, it really could have been incredible had some other things gone their way.
Alright guys, that's the end of the video. I hope y'all really enjoyed that. We got to see what happened to the biggest NBA trades of 2010s. That's the end of the video. I'm going to catch y'all in the next video. I'm going to see y'all later. Peace.